last few weeks about the Holy Land saga. And basically, it is, no, I'm not saying unfortunate, it's a serious issue. I don't want to call it racism in the Arab community here and back home. It's very prevalent in our community. You know, you hear a lot of Arabs use word abd a lot for referring to a black person. Even if you think he heard it, you know, it doesn't mean that political charge of slave here in this country, because slavery in this country is a little bit different than Layla Azmi Goushey. She is a PhD in adult education, teaching and learning process, and she's a professor of English at the community college in St. Louis, Missouri. Next to her, we have Dr. Nina Shoman Dajani. Yes. Okay. Assistant Dean of Learning Enrichment and College Readiness at Murian Valley. I kind of screwed this up, a community college in the southeast suburb of Chicago. She completed her doctorate degree in University of Higher Education. But you know, your doctoral topic, Nina, was racial identity construction of Arab American college students. And I know, Layla, you done some work back in the Arab world and in colleges in Jordan and Palestine and Egypt and all of that. But since this event is happening close to home, let's start with Nina and tell us a little bit about your work, about the racial identity. When we talk about racial identity, what are we talking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, as we know, in the United States, race is a social construct. This is something that race has been something that's been used to historically define communities in this country since its inception. And the historical references, when it comes to the Arab community, it's a very interesting story, because we actually, in the early 1900s, fought to become quote unquote white in this country. And the reason why Arab immigrants at that time did that is because the only way you can have rights in this country and own property and become successful was to be categorized under the race of white. I mean, that was the status quo then, and it is now. And through various court battles, this is the very, very abbreviated version of it. Through various court battles, we were classified as white, and we benefited from that privilege for decades. Not to say that Arabs at that time didn't face discrimination. Of course they did. We had been categorized under many different ways in the census and throughout the country at that time. But it's important to note, first, we fought for that category, but at that time, politically and socially and economically, you couldn't become successful in this country without being categorized as white. And then fast forward to generations of Arabs that came later from around the Arab world for different reasons, whether they were fleeing war, coming here for school or for economic gain, or to follow family members and create a life for themselves. The discrimination against Arab and Muslim communities is not something new. It's not something that started after September 11th. It's something that was prevalent for decades prior to that. And the Arab experience is just not white. Scholars have described it as not quite white. We don't fit that category. We no longer, many communities no longer identify themselves as white, even though the US Census identifies us as white. And research shows in certain communities, like, for example, the Chicagoland area where I live, research shows that Arabs do not identify with the term white, or at least the majority of Arabs here. That work was done years ago by Dr. Louise Kankar. Of course, in other parts of the country, you may have a different sentiment from various Arab communities. But I was interested in my research to find out how college students felt, because I work in higher education. I work in a college as an administrator, and I also teach classes on Arab Americans. And so I see on a college campus, for example, mine, that has a very large Arab student population, that they fall under the radar, and because they are not categorized as Arab American when they fill out their application, they are lumped together in the statistics of the white students, and that doesn't properly identify their needs as other groups are identified, for example, according to the race categories on the census, as Black or African American, Latino or Hispanic or Asian American. We don't have those statistics for Arab Americans, whether it's in higher ed or in other institutions. And so my research found that Arab American students, at least the ones I interviewed, do not identify as white. They do not feel like they reap the benefits of white privilege. And they want to be seen for who they are, which is Arab American.
Well, with the events of, and one of them, Mustafa, was asking, I want my Blackness back. I want my Black identity back. What is he talking about?
I don't have the exact quote in front of me right now.
Yeah, but
I think
identity.
Yeah, one of the things that, some of the students referenced was that they identify more with Black communities and white communities, with people of color and minority communities and marginalized communities. So they feel like they deserve that identity, and they want to be identified for who they feel they are, because on paper they're white, but clearly if you turn on the TV or watch the news or pop culture, whether it's in Hollywood and on the movies, Arabs are not seen as white. We're not treated as white. Not to say that many Arabs are not reaping the benefits and privilege of that identity, or that can pass as quote unquote white. Again, going back to the socially constructed manner in which people see people through race. But this generation it's not the same as those that were immigrating in 1900 and 1910 and 1920. And their needs, wants, and desires, and how they feel about their identity is much different than it was 100 years ago.
Layla, you've done some work in colleges back home in an Arab world. What is the attitude there? Are they aware of those racial identity? And because you're talking about a majority culture, it's a little bit different,
Well, it's interesting. I think that the professors I talked to reminded me of what Dr. Sleasley said recently, that the more you're exposed to education, the more aware you become of different people and different people's experiences. But I interviewed 12 faculty members from across the region, from Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Palestine. Into the study, it might be that I had the most motivated teachers reaching out to me to discuss, but I asked one question to start off, and I said, to define humanism, what does humanism mean to you? And almost everyone, some said it in more elaborate ways than others, but essentially it means equality, it means no discrimination of people, it means love all people regardless of their differences. And so you can read that in my study. And what I took from that is, and the rest of the study, is that there are individuals within all institutions in the Arab region. Some are studying character education and what it means to be a global citizen. But they're also within an ecosystem, which is what I look for in almost all situations. What are the surroundings that they're in? They're dealing not only with political realities in their home countries, but political realities even within their institutions. And as a faculty member here, I know that everything I hope to advocate for does not come to fruition. And so I see that there are some very bright lights in the Arab region, and we have to help support those voices that do want to take things maybe in a new direction, or even express their essential beliefs, because the purpose of my study was to discover what are some essential historical cultural beliefs about teaching within the Arab region, because we always seem to frame everything within a Western construct. So I was looking for the Arab Swana region construct. What is it? And so it is there, but like other political developments in the region, people need support to bring that narrative forward.
Nina, always one will bring race relationship in an Arab culture and Arab community, and this phenomenon where not just the Arab, the immigrants, when they come to this country, they adapt this white racist attitude toward blacks, even if they are from Africa, or even if they are even darker skinned themselves. And it seems like, I used to grow up and cheer for Gary Cooper and John Wayne, and I cheer for the winner, white winner. And when I came here, I found out I am the Indians.
I mean, this is a large topic and question. I can give you a soundbite on it, but it's something that we can talk about all day. I mean, I think that it's one thing to say that when they arrive here, they adopt that attitude, and another thing to explore the fact that many of them may have arrived here with that attitude. We have to remember that Arabs come from a colonized region, and unfortunately, some people in that region still, even those of us that have family in the region that still live there, and we go visit and we see it ourselves, have adopted the mentality of the colonizer to a certain extent. The divide and conquer tactics that were used against people in the Arab world, inherently, to a certain extent, they've been adopted by people that live there. Not everybody, of course. I mean, I can't categorize hundreds of millions of people in one way. But think about how, leadership is set up, how political systems are set up in the Arab world, and how sectarian it is in many places, and how, religion and class divide affect the way people live there. So, I mean, they already many times arrive here having experienced systems that were politically corrupt, or that had a curriculum in schools that wasn't holistic, or didn't teach the accurate history of even their own regions. And then you come here to a new country, you are trying to adapt. I personally, in my everyday work, do supervise a program, an English as a second language program, that has students from over 40 countries, but 40% of those students are adult students from the Arab world. And I see, women trying to come and learn English because they want to help their kids with their homework after school, and, husbands that come at night, and fathers to learn some English so they can get a better job. And, when we talk about immigrants coming to this country and their mentality, I mean, I think it's a survival mentality, and many people are trying to make ends meet. But moving on to the racism part, I mean, then they become products of their environment many times. And they do adopt sometimes the poor attitudes of their fellow community members. They do many times adopt that anti-Blackness sentiment that is in Arab and Muslim communities. Again, not all of them, but many of them do. Some of them, again, work in various areas, whether it be in major cities or in small towns, where their interactions with people from all walks of life are only they're only defined by those interactions in their workplace. And so they don't have experiences outside of that with communities in terms of building solidarity or learning about their cultures in a way that would actually provide them a more educational experience. And, as you had touched on before, that, when it comes to the curriculum and the schoolings and so on, and we can't depend on that to teach our children and we can't solely depend on that education in certain schools to educate our children about Black lives and Black solidarity and the history of slavery. If we're not talking about it at home and actually talking to our students, our children, about what it means to celebrate Columbus Day or what it means, to celebrate Indigenous people, then they're not going to necessarily learn that in school. So, I mean, again, these are big issues that deserve a lot of time and attention. But a couple things I just want to reiterate. Many times they arrive with that attitude, and it's reinforced by the communities that they live in. When people come to this country, many times they look for communities of people that look like them. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's where they feel a community, they feel safe, they feel that they can turn to people that speak their language for help. I mean, this is our tradition, not just an Arab tradition, but we see this in other communities as well, where when people come from overseas or from their home countries, we're there to adopt them and help them, right? And unfortunately, many times it's not about educating them about, how multicultural a society is, or teaching them about Black history and solidarity. And that's something we need to get better about. We can't blame anyone except our own communities for not doing the work. There are in major cities, and I haven't done a study on this, but I know that there's work happening probably in your communities. I know there's work happening in Chicago. I know where I grew up in Northern California, there was a lot of historical work done with Black communities, with Black solidarity, with Black liberation movements. I mean, there's a large Arab and Palestinian-led car caravan tomorrow for Black Lives Matters that's planned with a coalition that supports Black liberation and an overhaul of police in Chicago. So these are things that have been happening. This type of work has been happening for decades, but we haven't done a good job in bringing more people into those movements. 20 years ago, I was being invited to events for the All African People's Revolutionary Party's events in the community in Sacramento, California. But, again, that was because I was active in my community. I was part of activist work. We have to move beyond sharing information between activists and activist communities and do the work on a larger scale. There's, as educators, and I think Layla would agree with this, I think she and I had a conversation the other day, and she said to me, we're on the forefront here, and this is the work that we should be doing as educators. And several months ago, I started a network of Arab American educators with 3 other educators from Chicago and one from the East Coast. And the work that we're doing now has kind of shifted from providing resources and educating how to better serve Arab American students to now how can the Arab community better serve and teach about Black solidarity and Black liberation and Black history, and sharing resources that way.
Does it make any difference generational? Does it change, evolve, younger generation attitude toward this issue than their parents?
Yes. Ahmed, I want to follow up on that. Yes, I believe that the younger generation is seeing this from a different perspective than their parents. To kind of come back to the issue of the stores and bring that back in regard to this discussion, because we're actually looking at 2 different narratives happening. First of all, I agree there is anti-Blackness in the Arab American community as there is in the American community. What I was troubled by as all of this first emerged with the Cups food incident and the death of George Floyd is, out there on social media, which is reactive, there were statements, to the effect of, the store owner was Arab, he was racist, and that narrative took over. But when we look a little further at all that exactly happened, the nuance is different. And as for the Holy Land store, that is inexcusable. What had happened, whether she was influenced by peers or influenced by family, someone let that young person down at that time. And the family, I believe, does owe some restitution in one way or another to the not only the Black community but the Jewish community. So that, and I noticed that the Holy Land owner said, well, we're hiring a firm to educate us. And I think that can only be productive if there's an outcome to that education. So what would that education look like? So I'm saying all of this to say, you know, having had these experiences in St. Louis after the murder of Mike Brown in 2014, you know, I see it frequently within my classrooms because I normally teach, you know, an age range between, say, 18 and 35 and some older. Everyone, you know, community college is everybody. So we've had children of Arab American store owners. We have Black Americans. We have immigrants. We have refugees and immigrants from the Arab region. And so to help, you know, to help change hearts, to help change everyone's voice has to be in the room. One thing I haven't really seen yet on a lot of our panels is really where are the store owners to come in and talk about, you know, how they're experiencing not only this situation, but the experience of being an entrepreneur, coming to this country, encountering a different culture. I would say most people know it's wrong somewhere consciously to be racist, to participate in the white supremacist system. But it's one thing to say that, and it's another to do that. And my main concern was that we were using Arab store owners as a scapegoat when at all levels of all social and economic levels of the Arab American community, we need to look at ourselves. You know, I will get, I've had students write essays about walking into an Arab-owned or South Asian-owned store and their experience as a Black person walking into that store. Mm-hmm. And it is heartbreaking. It is something that, you know, motivates me to even more try to, you know, work with anti-racist, you know, organizations. But the main thing I want to say is to really change hearts, you can't talk at someone. You have to have that person in the room in conversation.
When you look at that young man, young immigrant, the clerk that he called 911, mm-hmm. When you look at the script, you get the feeling this guy has no clue about the gravity of calling a police on a Black person. To the point he was, you know, flirting with the operator at the end. He didn't know if she was, this George Floyd was an Asian or Black, or he, you know, his English or whatever. So I understand people are aware of their racism and their bigotry and bias, but I don't think we have the full understanding of the history of racism in this country, and the slavery, and the Black struggle, and civil rights, and all of this. If it wasn't for them, most of those immigrants would not be here. Nina, we are running out of time here. Could you address this? How much of this race, you know, how much of this racism that's seeping in immigrant, and especially you talk about the Arab Americans, is really well ingrained in our culture and our belief and our identity?
Just real quick, I wanted to touch back on, you know, the store owner. You know, I was reading a little bit about the history of the relationship between the store owner and the police in general. And, you know, sometimes those calls are made after years and years of these store owners being harassed by police and law enforcement to report small and minor crimes. And so, again, not an excuse that the phone call should have been made or anything like that. But when you dig a little deeper and you read about, you know, the history behind, you know, why these phone this phone call was made or why other calls are made. Sometimes it's, again, a pre-existing issue of law enforcement's relationship with these store owners, which is usually filled with tension. And EMAN, which is the Inner City Muslim Action Network, has a really good example of, they have something called the Corner Store Initiative, where they work to get corner store owners and the Black community to have more, have better relationships and to provide healthy alternatives to what's typically in these stores for communities to eat that are sometimes living in a food desert. And the Arab Resource and organizational group, AROC, in the San Francisco Bay Area does some of this work as well. So again, you know, these are very deep issues, things that have been going on for a long time. Obviously, it didn't just start with this one phone call. And, you know, to address, you know, the innateness of this is part of, you know, who we are as a community and so on. I mean, unfortunate, as was mentioned before, this anti-Black racism in the Arab community is something that it is something that is prevalent in Arab and Muslim communities. And this is something that we have to fix from inside. And we can't depend on anybody to come into our communities and, you know, set us straight. We are capable of doing that ourselves. And as educators, we have a large role in doing that. You know, a few years ago, or it might have been a year or two ago, I was at a large fundraiser in Chicago for an Arab organization, and Mark Lamont Hill was the keynote speaker. And Mark Lamont Hill, as you know, is a very well-known scholar and activist, and he's done a lot of work that focuses on Palestinian solidarity and Black liberation. But he took that opportunity also to call out racism in the Arab community. And I thought it was like such a great addition to his speech, because he didn't have to add that, but he had a room full of 600 or 700 Arabs, and he's the keynote speaker. And so, you know, we love when they're scholars and they're authors and they're poets, and we love the culture and the sports and all of that. But how do we talk about people with, you know, Black skin in our own communities? And he called it out, and he called out the use of abd as a reference to Black people and Black communities. And I think that it was a good chance to get people thinking, and this type of work, you know, has to go beyond just mentioning at a fundraiser. Then we have to do the work inside our communities. And I see a lot of webinars and a lot of professional development opportunities now, and personal development opportunities for people to, you know, talk about anti-Blackness in Arab communities. And this is something that Asian communities are addressing as well. There's been numerous statements put out by Arab organizations, scholarly organizations, community organizations, university organizations, all tied to the Arab community, about solidarity with Black communities, solidarity with Black liberation. But we need to go beyond statements and put, you know, put some things in action and, you know, participate in putting in the work and, you know, engaging in and supporting the work of Black communities.
Layla, I'll give you the last word. We have 1 minute left here. Anything to add or wrap all this together?
Well, of course, Black Lives Matter. That's the key that we need to remember in this particular time. But I would say that a simple theory of teaching is you change hearts by having people engage in dialogue. We can't just talk at or offer advice. We have to engage everyone.
Dr. Goushey is a PhD in adult education, teaching and learning, a professor of English at Community College in St. Louis, Missouri. And also we have, you know, Dr. Nina Shaman Dajani, Assistant Dean of Learning, Enrichment, and College Readiness at Marina Village Community College in the southwest of suburb Chicago. We thank you so much for giving us the time. You guys, you are on the front line, doing a great job. Keep up the good work. This is not an easy. It takes this country more than 250 years to deal with it. We're still talking about it. It's still as bad as it is now. So we're not asking too much of the Arab American community. It's a long way to go. But we have tools, we have people like you who can educate us, and they are on the front line. Keep up the good work, and thank you so much for joining us today. And have a good day. Stay home and stay healthy. Black
Thank
Lives
you,
Matter.
Ahmed.
Black Lives Matter.